All right, we're at our last video in our Working Constitution series, The Four Cornerstones. We've been looking at this idea that the framers of the Constitution, the guys who wrote it, Madison, Morris, all those guys, created a strong central government, but were able to limit the power of that government and protect people's rights. And we've mostly been talking about the limits um, on the government through federalism. We give certain powers to the states, separation of powers, we break them up into three branches. Constitutional flexibility kind of gives them a little bit of leeway to make laws necessary and proper through the elastic clause, through the amendment process, through judicial review. But today we're going to focus on the people's rights part with equal rights. We're going to focus on this idea that laws are created with the equal rights in mind for all Americans, to kind of wrap that up. Now, when we talk about equal rights, we talk about this idea that the Constitution guarantees all people equal rights. Now, that's the theory, but the question we get into is, it always been true? And we're going to find our answer is no, it hasn't always been true. But over time, the Constitution and really the government, more importantly, has been forced to kind of evolve over time. And we're going to see that process throughout the year. How do we get from being a government that protected mostly the guys that look like the ones on the left to all Americans? And so one example of that would be voting rights. Throughout the year, we're going to look at a number of laws and amendments of voting rights. For example, in 1870, the 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote. Later, women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. 23rd Amendment expanded that to residents of Washington, D.C. The 24th Amendment abolished poll taxes, meaning people sometimes used to have to pay to vote, and if you didn't have money to pay, you couldn't vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed literacy tests. You had to prove that you could read or prove that you understood the law well enough to vote. And we're going to look at those examples throughout the year. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. That was during the Vietnam War, and we'll look at why that was later in the year. But it's really this idea that when we look at voting rights, originally the people who could vote were these white landowners, white men in powdered wigs and knee breeches who owned land, and only they could vote. In the 1820s, we're going to examine how that was expanded to all white men, regardless of whether you own property or not. You didn't have to have a property requirement to vote. And I already mentioned that in 1870, with the 15th Amendment, that right was expanded to all men, regardless of their race or color. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment expanded that to all adults, regardless of their race, color, or sex or gender. And with the Voting Rights Act, it expanded it so that you didn't have to pay or you didn't have to prove that you could read. And also, at about the same time, a few years later, they lowered that to all adults, so down to age 18. The idea being that if you could go off to war and die, you should have a say over who sends you there. And so, really, how do we get from these guys who are white men who own land to really all adult Americans voting? And so equal rights is really about the process. It's not about, how it should work. It would be great if it did, but it's more about how did we get there, and is there anywhere else we need to go as we look at equal rights throughout the year. So just to kind of think about the videos, all four videos, think about federalism. That's a tough concept because the word federalism makes students only think federal government, but you need to think federal and state in that process. And remember, separation of powers are three branches. But start to look at some of those specific examples, particularly ones with the House and Senate. We're going to see examples of where, for example, one time the Senate didn't approve a treaty negotiated by the president. We're going to talk about why. Constitutional flexibility, we're going to be constantly looking for that throughout the year. So we're going to be looking at some key amendments, some key Supreme Court cases throughout the whole year. And then finally, equal rights. Where do we see equal rights being promoted? Where do we see them being denied? We're going to be looking throughout the whole year. So really, this video series is a great thing to come back to because it really is the backbone for what we're going to study this year. And when we look at historic events, you should be saying, oh, there's an example of federalism. Oh, there's equal rights, or there's a denial of equal rights. So I hope these videos help us really think about these things as we move forward.